Let's turn our attention to the first burglary case we're going to consider, Creasy versus State. I asked you to complete a pre-lecture assessment on the case, so let's see how you did. In this case, defendant was convicted of burglary. First, I want us to look at the statute to see which elements are required for burglary in Indiana. Now, in a prior lecture, I told you there isn't really any need for you to memorize or learn a particular statute. We didn't have to learn the statute that was controlling in Decina, in the operation of a vehicle. We don't have to learn the statute that's controlling in Indiana. What we do have to do is look and see the statute. What are the elements in that statute? How does it compare to the common law to get our grounding? We can see that this crime looks a lot like the common law definition of burglary. What are we looking for? We're looking for a defendant to break and enter with an intent to commit a felony therein. The two elements that were required at common law that are missing, there's no nighttime requirement, and it doesn't have to be of a dwelling. Here, nighttime has been dropped completely, and the word building is a substitute for the word dwelling. Creasy claimed two issues on appeal. First, he claimed he didn't break into the sorority house. Both doors were open leading into the main house, was his claim, and he just walked right in. He may have been inside the house, so he may have entered the house, but he didn't break into the house, which was one of the elements required at statute. Remember, the prosecution must prove all the elements for the burglary conviction to stand. If even one element is missing, then defendant is acquitted. So he says there was no breaking. Second, he claimed, in addition to an actus reus defense, he said, I have a mens rea defense. I didn't enter with an intent to commit a felony. When I entered that house, I had no intent to commit a felony, and you can't prove it. So let's take each issue separately. To determine whether there was a breaking, we need a good working definition of that element. Here we can find the definition inside the case. Did you find the definition? That was one of the questions during the pre-assessment. Definition is going to be controlling for us. Here, Creasy gives us a great definition. Breaking means some physical movement of the structural impediment, creating an opening. You have moved aside part of the structure. What about the other statements surrounding that definition in our case? So we see that definition, and then we see some other statements: opening an unlocked door, or pushing a door that's slightly ajar. These are great examples. They're not the definition. The definition we work with is the movement of the structural impediment. Although when we think about examples, these make great sense. Pushing open a door, lifting up a window, these are all examples for rules for breaking, but they're not the rule. How does the prosecution establish that Creasy broke in? So he says the doors were open. We know he's inside the house, so we know he got into the house, but how did he get into the house? Did he actually move the structural impediment? Did he open the door to get inside? This case offers us wonderful examples of circumstantial evidence at play. The prosecution is going to put together as much evidence as it has to show that Creasy broke into the house, that he didn't just walk into the house. Did you spot them in the case? The first is the police officer's testimony, and although it may feel a little vague to you, I want us to delve into it. He reported it was a snowy night. And implied in that is, if it were a snowy night and the snow is coming in, if the door had been open, he would have expected to see snow on the floor. And he didn't see any snow. So that would suggest that the door was closed. That's the first piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence is testimony by a sorority sister who said that generally that was their habit. Each night they checked to make sure the doors were locked. Now, generally speaking, if there's a habit that you engage in, it's hard to say, oh yeah, 3 weeks ago I know for sure I locked the doors. I checked to see that they were locked. But if that's something that's a habit of yours, that's a pretty believable statement. And we'll add one more fact to this. This was a sorority house. So it's really believable that in a sorority house, probably a sorority sister was walking around making sure that the doors were locked. That's a cautious act for people who are concerned for their safety. So checking the doors sounds plausible. Probably that means the doors were shut. And taken with the officer's testimony, we could probably think that Creasy opened at least one of the doors to get inside the house. So if you think about the definition of breaking, which we have to have for this statute, we can say that we believe Creasy broke into the house. He moved aside that door. He created that opening. We know that Creasy entered the house. Remember, that's an element that has to be proven. How do we know that? He was found in the basement. So we know he actually made his way into the house. The second real issue of the case is whether Creasy had a felonious intent when he entered the sorority house. Remember that for burglary to occur, we need both the action, breaking and entering, and we need at the same moment a felonious intent. So let's examine what the prosecution argued. Here, the prosecution argued that Creasy went there to steal. Prosecution says that Creasy went into the sorority house to steal, and how does the prosecution know that? Well, he cut apron strings the moment he entered the sorority house. He had them in his possession, and when he was found, he was holding a t-shirt. So the prosecution said he must have been there to steal items from the sorority house. I want you to think about this whole case in its full context. Do you think that Creasy went there to steal? Or do you have a different idea of what Creasy might have been doing when he broke inside the house? I'm interested in your thoughts, and I'd like you to take a poll on this. If you didn't buy the idea that Creasy went to steal, you're not alone. Many people who read this case think that Creasy may have had some other intention. After all, he had a knife in his pocket, he was entering a sorority house, and what did he do the moment he got inside that house? He cut apron strings from the laundry room, and then he grabbed a t-shirt. Well, maybe he was there to commit a sexual assault. Maybe he was there to tie up a girl, throw a t-shirt over her head as a surprise to prevent her knowing his identity. So maybe he was there to rape or sexually assault one of the girls. Maybe he was there to commit a different kind of a sexual act. What's confusing, though, about thinking about that as his intent is that he prowled around the house and he did nothing to the girls on the second floor. He didn't sexually assault them. He had the opportunity to do that, and instead he went down to the basement. Maybe he was there to case the place and return to sexually assault somebody, or maybe he's just a creep. Maybe he was going down to the basement to look and feel the women's clothing. Maybe he was going around to vandalize the house or to commit some other kind of criminal mischief. His prior criminal history suggests he may have been there to harass or intimidate the women. It doesn't look like he was there to steal. In fact, you have now learned what I actually call this case. For me, the case is Creepy Creasy, and in fact, that's what he is. So if many people think he was there to commit a sexual assault, if you don't really think he was there to steal, why didn't the prosecution charge with that intent? Why didn't the prosecution put in the charging document burglary with the intent to commit sexual assault? The reason is pretty simple, because that would have been very hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, especially in light of the fact that Creasy never went over to one of the girls, never touched one of the girls, never looked like he was going to harass or rape one of the girls. How were they going to prove that's what his intent was at the start? He was prowling around the house while the girls were sleeping, and he did nothing. So one could say they actually took the easiest way out. We're only supposed to consider the mens rea at the front end. When we pause that movie, when we freeze that frame, we're supposed to look at that would-be burglar and say, when you entered the house, what is it that you were thinking of committing? What were you planning to do when you broke in? But here what we have is a little bit of what I call result-oriented thinking going on. They fast-forward the movie. They looked at what Creasy ended up doing. He was caught with a t-shirt holding it, so they said, well, we think he at least was going to steal. There's also another thing that happens here. Most burglaries are accompanied with an intent to steal, so it's not so far-fetched to suggest that he may have been doing that. But we really don't think that's what was going on. What's interesting when you look at all of the other prior cases that he was charged with, they couldn't stick on anything. Here, he may not have been there to steal, but ironically, he ends up being convicted of burglary with the intent to steal. I want to examine briefly the third issue of the case. Was it really proper to add 4 years onto the sentence because of Creasy's prior arrests? Notice there in that last set of paragraphs, Creasy was never convicted of those crimes. Lots of smoke, no fire. Yet the trial court said there's a pattern here. You're breaking into a sorority house. Here, you have prior incidents of criminal mischief and sexual assault, sexual harassment, lots of arrests. We think it is proper to add on the 4 years. Don't forget, this went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Indiana, probably less so for the breaking and entering and intent parts of the case, and more because of this, that is there something wrong with adding those 4 years? The court said it wasn't, that the trial court was legally justified because of that prior history. Do you think that's correct? Should he have been given an extra 4 years when there weren't convictions? The Supreme Court said it's perfectly fine based upon those arrests to have done that.